Shalom Aleichem, Assalamu Alaikum. Welcome to 2nd Chronicles, chapter 18, and the title of this video is What is the bread and water of affliction? There are 34 verses in this chapter, beginning in verse 1. It describes how King Jehoshaphat connected himself by marriage with the house of Ahab, versus joined affinity with Ahab, which means becoming son-in-law. So essentially the same thing. Verse 2, desired him to go up versus persuaded him to go up. It's one thing to want somebody to do something. It's another thing to persuade them and convince them to go. Verse 5, shall I versus shall we. You'll notice this continuous difference throughout this narrative in this chapter, I versus we. Verse 7, for all his days are evil. Meaning, for all his days he has prophesied for evil, is King Ahab's description of the prophet Micah, versus but always evil. He's always an evil person. No, he's talking about he prophesied always evil. So it's interesting how the Septuagint is describing all his days, and the Masoretic describing how he's always evil. So perpetually, permanently evil in terms of the prophecies he would speak. Verse 10, thrust versus push. So it's one thing to thrust through, another thing to push with the iron horns. You don't typically push with horns, you do thrust through like a bull would, or a rhinoceros, known as a unicorn in scriptures, interestingly enough. Verse 11, you shall prosper versus and prosper. Okay, what's the difference here? You shall prosper versus and prosper. Okay, so it's missing an and, or I should say it's missing you shall. So this is more of a promise, you could say, more of a certainty that he will prosper. Verse 12, have spoken favorably. Okay, let me get there before I read it. I want to keep this honest. You have spoken, it says, have spoken favorably concerning the king with one mouth, versus the prophets declare good to the king with one assent, or mouth. Mouth is another way to, it's a synonym for assent in this context. So let's explore this a little bit. It says, have spoken favorably. So the multitudes of prophets that are not Micah have spoken favorably concerning the king, versus the words of the prophets are good. So it's not so much that it's good, it's more that it's in favor of the king. These are favorable things to be spoken concerning the king, regarding the king, not just good things to the king that he likes. It's regarding his situation, regarding his well-being perhaps, and the prosperity of his kingdom. The footnote, interestingly enough, reads, thou shalt speak. So this is a commandment from the king, not a suggestion. So what is this talking about? It says, let now I pray thee, thy words be as one of them, and do thou speak. So this part, and do thou speak, let me specify, that is, do thou speak. The footnote reads, thou shalt speak. It's not so much a suggestion. Okay, you can speak this, speak good things. No, you shall speak good things. So this is a commandment from the king again, And uh, typically in ancient times, the word of the king is as good as law. Recall the book of Esther, which we haven't covered yet, but if you've read that book, you will know the king cannot go back on their word. Whatever they say has to be enforced. And again, their word is as good as law. So if the king is saying, you shall speak good things, then Micah would have to speak the truth on the penalty of death. That is what's on the balance, his own life. So that puts into context why he would be somewhat uneasy to tell him the truth. And so we see that he actually says, first he lays down the law, his own personal conviction, saying, as Yah lives, or as Adonai lives, Hashem lives, whatever Elohim shall say to me, that will I speak. And then verse 14, we see the king asking Micah the question, shall I go up to battle? And then we see, shall I, or it says, shall I go up versus shall we? Again, continuous difference in verse 14. And then verse 15, the king tells Micah, just tell me the truth. How often do I have to tell you, tell me the truth. Don't speak to me anything but truth. And I solemnly charge you to do this in the name of Hashem. In verse 15, it says there's an addition of to me, truth to me. Well, I mean, obviously speak truth to me. That is a given. Verse 16, and all Israel, all was added. I saw Israel scattered in the mountains, etc. And then verse 17, I'm going to skip over verse 18, significant difference, because the question that Jehoshaphat asks, I should say, Ahab said to Jehoshaphat, didn't I tell you he would not prophesy concerning me good but evil? And then we hear Micah say, not so. He's saying, no, this isn't so. And this was omitted. So he's answering the question. He's answering the question, saying, no, this is not evil. He's going to detail as to why this isn't evil. So in verse 19, it says here, deceive versus entice, and the Hebrew word can mean deceive as well, or persuade. Verse 22, false spirit versus lying spirit, and the word for lying is the Hebrew sheker, 8267 Strongs, and it can mean deception or falsity. So I'm just going to expound on this a little bit. So in truth, it was not Micah who spoke evil against King Ahab. Why? Because it was the false spirit that spoke through the prophets, the multitudes of prophets, the other prophets, because they spoke favorable things and were in fact lying to Ahab, because this was a false report, again brought to the prophets through this false spirit to falsely advise King Ahab to follow something that would eventually lead to not being prosperous, but him being defeated and eventually his death. Okay, verse 26. So this is the title of this video. What is the bread of affliction? Is it matzo? Because that has been called the bread of affliction. And what is the water of affliction? Is it, gross prison food like in the thumbnail? Is it moldy bread and dirty water? Maybe is it even salt water? Or perhaps even vinegar? So I'm going to read from Eliot's commentary. I don't normally do this. Ellicott. It says here, bread of affliction and with water of affliction. In the Hebrew, the second word, lachatz, is not a genitive, but an accusative, bread with stint or water with stint, literally squeezing. In the Vulgate, panis modicum et aquae pauxilium, or pauxilum, Syriac bread, which is enough to keep life, and water enough to keep life. So it's the bare minimum to keep one alive. And I'm going to read from this source, myholybible.org. Goes into that just a little bit. I won't go too deep into that. Okay, so the bread of affliction and the water of affliction. It could be a form of divine punishment. That's the way some people understood that. Here's some cross references for you. Psalm 102, I have eaten ashes like bread, mingled my drink with weeping. That's from the Masoretic. Isaiah 30, verse 20, and though Hashem give you the bread of adversity and the water of affliction, yet shall not your teachers be removed into a corner anymore. And again, that's not what it says in the Septuagint, the last part of it anyway. The key phrase bread of affliction in Hebrew is lechem and water, lechem zar and mayim lachatz. The word lechem typically refers to bread or food in general. So again, it doesn't have to be literally bread. It can mean just food in general. It could be, pasta, rice, that's bread. It's meat. And it doesn't mean meat as in carnivore, like actual animal products. It could mean bread. General food, meat or bread means that. And zar often means adversity or affliction. Likewise, mayim means water, and lachatz conveys the sense of oppression or distress. Understanding these terms in their original language sheds light on the intended harshness of the punishment. Okay, all right, let me try to scan through this really quick. I think that's it, okay. But essentially, if we look at let's just read these notes here. In many ancient cultures, including those in the biblical Middle East, imprisonment and prescribed diets were common forms of punishment and means of demonstrating power over enemies. Such punishments also appear in ancient myths where gods or kings may impose harsh conditions on their adversaries as a means of exacting obedience or revenge. From a scientific perspective, while not always directly related to modern scientific understanding, the verse indirectly touches upon the concept of basic human needs for survival, nutrition, and hydration. From a scientific perspective, bread of affliction and water of affliction might provide just enough, again, the bare minimum, to keep someone alive without affording them any comfort or pleasure. So you wouldn't eat to fullness or drink to fully quench your thirst. A concept parallel to the physiological understanding of minimum sustenance. So that's essentially it. It's minimum sustenance. Okay, going back to the text here, verse 27, significant difference. This is an interesting burn. I just call it a burn. So the king said to Micah, put this fellow into the prison house, let him eat the bread of affliction and drink the water of affliction until I return in peace. And then Micah snaps back at him and says, if you do at all return in peace, you can hear the bit of sarcasm in there, a little bit of attitude. Versus the Masoretic, how's he responding? If you certainly return in peace. So it sounds a little more formal. In the Septuagint, it's way more, more attitude there. Okay, verse 29, talking about King Ahab telling Jehoshaphat to disguise me. So he's asking him, you disguise me, versus I will disguise myself. Now, if we go back to 1 Kings 22, verse 30, I'm just going to refer to it here. This is a big difference in the narrative between the two translations. King Ahab is describing my raiment. I'm going to go there. Okay, so 1 Kings chapter 22, verse 30. This is the connection here. And the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I will disguise myself and enter into the battle. So it's interesting. The Septuagint is saying that King Ahab is disguising himself. So perhaps it's a mistranslation in the in 2nd Chronicles 18. And enter into the battle, and you do put on my raiment. So put on my clothing versus you put on your own clothing. That doesn't make sense. Why would he? How are they both disguised if they're both wearing what they normally wear? So Jehoshaphat is, I should say, King Ahab is disguising himself as not King Ahab, and then he's disguising King Jehoshaphat as King Ahab, essentially. Versus, wear your own clothes. So that is interesting. That's why they almost killed King Jehoshaphat, but then Hashem gave them the discernment to recognize, no, that's actually not Jehoshaphat, that's someone else. And then they turned away from pursuing him, as we will see in the narrative. Okay, so back to our 2nd Chronicles 18. In verse 31 now. So the captains of the chariots saw Jehoshaphat. They said, it is the king of Israel. They were going to fight or essentially kill him. But it says that Hashem delivered him, saved him, versus helped him. So no, he really saved him. It was full on saving his life, not just assisting. And then it says Elohim turned them away from him, versus Elohim moved them from him, or to depart from him. So how do they know they departed? Well, the Septuagint exists. That's why. Verse 32 says, saw that it was not the king of Israel, so they could see with their own eyes versus perceiving it. So they did perceive it, but they did see with their own eyes. They proved it to themselves. It was not the king of Israel. Verse 33. A man drew a bow with good aim. So this is a sharpshooter, as we call a sniper. Versus drew a bow at a venture. And venture in the Hebrew means integrity. I don't know if this is the right word here. Okay, it is. It's the Hebrew tom, or tome, 8537. So that word means integrity, fullness, innocence, integrity. So how can you pull a bow with integrity? Maybe he was pulling the bow, aiming naively, not knowing what he's aiming at. So that is one way to interpret it. But it has no connection to what happens next, because it describes how he was able to aim and hit the king of Israel between the lungs and the breastplate. That requires good aim, not integrity, innocence, fullness, etc. And interestingly, I put integrity twice, so I'm going to just do that, edit that. So in the Septuagint, it says between the lungs and the breastplate versus the joints of the harness. In any case, it was a great shot. That's the point. And then the last verse we'll look at is verse 34. Talks about how the battle turned. So the battle turned. It was going one way and it turned the other way. That's one way to interpret it. Versus the battle increased. So it only escalated, it ascended in that day. Maybe exacerbated is one way to reckon that. So that's all for this chapter. Thank you very much for your time. Until next time, I bid you all Shalom Aleichem, Assalamu Alaikum, Irini Mazisu, Pax Vobiscum, peace be unto you, and Maranatha.